essentially, there's two broad categories when we're talking about attachment styles. So, first to say, everyone in this world has an attachment style. It's just a way in which we form an emotional bond and or the strategies that we use to protect ourselves when we feel emotionally threatened. That's where we see this most, right? So there's two broad categories of styles. One is called a securely attached person, and the other is insecure attached person. Okay. Now, within the insecure attached box, there are three subcategories. It's like a continuum, a spectrum. So when you're insecurely attached, you can go in one of three different ways. You could be dismissive avoidant,
Mhm.
you can be anxious preoccupied, or you could have traits from both of those buckets and fall somewhere in the middle, sort of like a mixed bag, like what you were describing, which is called the fearful avoidant, also called disorganized attachment.
Oh, okay.
So if you count all those, that comes to four: secure attachment, dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, fearful avoidant. Those are the four. So in North America, we say that about 40 to 50% of the population is predominantly securely attached. Now that number, sways a little bit back and forth, but I like to use 50% just sort of as like a guide, right? Which means that the other 50% of our population of adults has an insecure attachment, right? Just to give you a sense.
Right.
So, someone who has a secure attachment grew up in a home, in broad strokes, where they received a fair deal of emotional attunement, predictability, and safety from their caregivers, which meant that they were taught about their emotions. Their parents were generally emotionally regulated. It is not that the parents never made a mistake. It is not that the parents, never got upset about things or yelled. We all do, right? We all have thresholds for when, our nervous system says enough, right? So this is not about perfection. What it is that it's a template whereby the child felt that they were safe and could predict how the caregiver would interact with them in a pretty consistent way, right? So if the child was upset, they were consoled, they were comforted, they were given space to have their feelings, they were taught about emotional regulation, right? Children who are taught, for example, it's okay to be angry. Tell me why you're angry. It's not okay to slam the door and throw your shoes,
Mhm.
right? That is not behavior that's acceptable in the home. But it's okay to be angry. And what can we, here are some of the things that I do when I'm angry. I go for a walk, that helps me. I listen to music, that helps me. Children who learn these strategies really early on, they grow up into adults who are generally pretty stable, who have good life skills. And when the time comes for them to become romantic partners themselves, they do very well in romantic partnerships. They're generally very good communicators. They understand boundaries. They're very good with conflict. And they also understand the concepts of I can be good on my own. I'm good when I'm independent, and I'm also good when we're interdependent, right? When we're together. So I have a balance of needs of being alone and also togetherness. So that's sort of the utopia, right, of what we're aiming for. Now I'm going to move into the insecure realm, and I think you'll see sort of some of the examples that'll bring out what I'm really talking about, right? What actually starts to drive a child into a more insecure pattern, right? Where they feel unsafe. So, again, we talked about two primary ways that when a child develops an insecure attachment because they didn't receive that predictable emotional attunement from their parent, they could either become avoidant in nature or anxious in nature. So, the person who becomes anxious in nature, this is usually as a result of a parent who is quite unpredictable. So one day they're loving and the next day they're not loving. A father who is one day emotionally available and the next day not there. The core wound there that the child ends up developing is I will be abandoned. right? And so they start developing a series of, we at that time we call it parent pleasing gestures and behaviors to seek the attention, the reassurance, the validation of the parents because they have received some love from the parents and they know it feels good. Every child desires the love of their parents and attention, but they have also received where the parent has pulled away that attention. Not always even punitively, right? It's just, maybe one of the parents has a mental illness, right? And one day they're loving and the next day they're not feeling well. Maybe there's alcoholism in the family. Maybe one parent is traveling a lot for work. It's not that the parent is trying to cause harm, but to a very young child, they don't understand why one day mommy is here and the next day she isn't.
Right.
So that starts to become concerning to the child. And so what the child does is they start to become overly congenial, right? They become parent pleasers. And the idea is that they want to become really likable. In the thought process of a child, if I'm so likable, you'll never leave me.
Oh, that's dangerous because that gives them
Yeah,
opportunity.
exactly. And so the core wounds that type of person, that child will grow up with can be a series of things. I will be abandoned. I am unlikable. I will be excluded. I am unworthy. I will be alone, all of these things. And you can see how that might start to play out in a romantic context. So these individuals, very interesting, they actually really, really enjoy being around other people. Part of it is because they never developed the ability to self soothe. So they're overly reliant on the input from external sources. They don't trust themselves. They don't trust themselves. They afford trust to a lot of other people. And so they're generally feeling their nervous system in a calm, relaxed state when they're around a lot of people. So they love family gatherings. They're usually the ones who are creating the big holiday parties. They're usually in professions where they're surrounded by people all day long. Like we see them often become teachers, kids, people all day long, right?
Right.
And so we actually see these traits sort of following us even in the professions that we choose, right? And so for this cohort of people being alone, because the I will be abandoned core wound is so strong, even being alone for a Saturday evening, let's say plans get canceled, that just feels really threatening to them,
Wow.
really threatening. They're likely to just go out to a bar themselves and hope to find a few friends hanging out. Spending a night alone at home for them is like, so when they get into relationships, we see this very often, they bounce from relationship to relationship to relationship. They have a very hard time being single.
Hmm.
They often chase emotionally unavailable partners, which is generally a dynamic that they learned early in childhood, where they got sort of breadcrumbs, maybe from one of their parents, right? They got attention sometimes and sometimes they didn't. So they got used to sort of chasing after little bits of attention and affection. And that's what formed their template for this is love. The other way that a child can go if they don't get that emotional attunement is they can become avoidantly attached, right? So this is generally seen in a home where a child is emotionally neglected or overly controlled. They have identified that closeness, intimacy is scary or painful. So a lot of the times these children are dismissed. They're left alone a lot. Think about the baby who cries and nobody comes to get them. And that's been refuted now. I know there was they let them cry, the Ferber, the baby, I think it was called. I don't even know. The Ferber method with that all mothers used at one point. That's been debunked as actually psychologically quite damaging. A child absolutely really needs the connection to their primary caregiver that could be mother, father, aunt, grandmother, whoever the child sees as their primary caregiver, they need that connection. And when they cry, which is really their only way of communicating, they need to know that they can get comfort, that they have safety, that they'll be listened to, that they'll be responded to in a healthy way. So children who are emotionally neglected, and there's so many different scenarios, right? So it could be a household, for example, where there's too many children in the house, right? To just that child is just left unseen. The parents can simply be way too busy or, consumed with other things. Maybe there's illness in the family or whatnot. Oftentimes we see this, where one child is ill and gets all the attention and the rest of the children are sort of neglected, right? Because there's only so much attention you can give, right? We see this in homes that the parents are very stoic, meaning emotions are not shown, right? So it's, you have 3 meals a day and a hot bed to sleep in, but there's no I love yous, there's no hugs. We see this often in high demand religions
Mm.
where children are not hugged, they're not given that love, they're there to perform, they're there as a function. There are lots of scenarios whereby children are emotionally neglected, where we're not attuned. There's also some scenarios very common with a mother and sometimes their son, where it's a form of exaggerated enmeshment, where there's not, I would say, simple boundaries between the mother and the son. So sometimes a child is parentified and asked to behave in a way that is above their years of maturity. So a single mother might use her son as sort of a surrogate spouse emotionally and talk about her problems psychologically. If the mother is unwell, the child often becomes the caregiver. All of these different types of scenarios, there are lots of them, will often result in a child who develops an avoidant attachment style. The dismissive avoidant person really learns to live life on their own little island. They are very uncomfortable with conflict. They're very slow to warm up to other people. They don't trust other people because they learned that I can't rely on my caregivers to meet my needs. So I'm not going to be able to rely on anyone else. It's really me, myself, and I. And so they have sort of a wall up. They're difficult to get close to emotionally. It's very difficult for them to experience vulnerability because they learned in childhood, oftentimes, if they showed vulnerability, they were punished, right? Or criticized or whatever else. And so these people have a very hard time when they grow up getting into relationships. In fact, they often choose not to. These are the people that we see in the dating pool that often choose to entertain situationships. And they're the ones that let's just see where it goes, and because they don't want to commit. Their biggest fear is having to absorb someone else's emotional compass. They don't want you to rely on them like their mother once did, for example, for emotional support, right? It doesn't feel good to them. They need a tremendous amount of alone time. Whereas the anxious person loves being surrounded by people, the avoidant person avoids mostly other people, avoids conflict, avoids intimacy, vulnerability, and they prefer to be alone. And so these are the two different spheres that can generally emerge in general terms when a child is not given that emotional consistency. Now, there is a third sphere, which is the fearful avoidant, which is a mix of some traits of the avoidant attacher and some traits of the anxious attacher. In the literature, it's called disorganized attacher. It's the same thing, fearful avoidant, disorganized, and generally, people will develop this particular attachment style when there's abuse in the home, right? Or, a high degree of conflict where it really felt unsafe. And, if you look at it from a child's perspective, the reason that they become disorganized in their way to attach to someone is because as a child, let's say I'm talking about my father, right? A little girl will look at her father like he's the one that brought the sun out in the morning, right? Like she's the best thing ever. And so the little girl is always seeking the father's reassurance, attention, validation, all of that comfort. But in some situations, that person who is the only person who offers that level of comfort to the child is also harming the child. So physically, psychologically, emotionally, could be sexually. And so the child becomes disorganized in their thought pattern between wanting to get close to this person because they bring me comfort and also being petrified to get close to them because they also harm me.
Mm.
So they oscillate between coming close and backing up and coming close and backing up. And when they grow into adults, they often get coined as the hot and the cold partner,
Oh,
right? So one day they're hot, one day they're cold. And that's because they don't fully trust themselves, but they also don't fully trust other people.
mhm.
So these patterns are, I would say, really pervasive for how it is that we feel about ourselves and how we experience the world for many, many years after we leave our home of origin.
Yeah.